So my guest today is Stefano Merlo, who is a PhD researcher and a junior lecturer at the John Stuart Mill College of the Free University of Amsterdam, and also a visiting scholar at UCL. I'm also pleased to say he's a master's graduate at UCL. He is the coordinator of the Political Economy of Europe Working Group of the Young Scholars Initiative, which is a research platform sponsored by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He is working at the intersection of macroeconomics and Republican political theory, so ethics and public policy central to his work, in order to carry out normatively informed institutional analysis of the European Economic and Monetary Union. And as part of this project, he is looking at the compatibility of independent agencies with democratic principles. Stefano, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
Good. So let me begin, I suppose, with the obvious question for anyone working on Republican political theory and public policy, which is, I suppose, that Republican political theory is most obviously associated with the principle of freedom as non-domination. Would you accept that characterization?
Yeah, so I do definitely accept that categorization, although one should probably mention the usual debate between liberals and Republicans on exactly how unique this idea of non-domination is. And as part of my project, I have so far not really touched upon that discussion. I still think that there's something interesting and novel about non-domination. And specifically, I think what's quite interesting is the connection with democracy. And I guess the idea kind of runs as follows, that a controlled form of interference would not be inimical to a Republican. And from that point on, you can see that the nature and the quality of that control can be casted in democratic terms. So to put it simply, if we can control the interference that our state and our lawmaking imposes on us, then maybe we shouldn't feel that we are that we'll be arbitrarily interfered with, and therefore that we are unfree. Now, this is something that I think goes slightly beyond the liberal idea that interference as such is a problem for your freedom. But of course, it raises some challenging cases in a sense that laws that are being controlled and democratically elected could still reasonably say to limit people's freedom. For instance, if you're in jail, that's could be the easiest and most tough case. So I would say that there is the interference, the controlled interference that we Republicans really care about.
So that's a very helpful answer. I just want to pick up on that before going to the next question, if I may. So I suppose when you talked about the controversy between liberals and Republicans, that really is about the thought that liberals just say, well, what Republicans are talking about is the security of liberties rather than liberty itself. And part of the reply that a Republican might make at that point is to say, well, that liberal notion of security of liberties fits very well with the idea of constitutional protection, but doesn't fit so well with the idea that it's the people who control government. Is that the sort of distinction you would have in mind?
Yeah, I see how the two things could diverge in that sense, and I think sometimes we run the risk of ascribing too strict a criteria to each position, in a sense that I think that control, the idea of controlled interference, can be casted in terms of very different institutional settings and with very different institutional backgrounds. Now, the usual case would probably be the Constitution. At least Pettit would probably agree that the Constitution is necessary because the interference that majorities could bring about appears to be arbitrary in and of itself. So I still have not actually made up my mind yet of what exactly, on the different kind of policy making sides, what the best institutional setting is. And I guess that's really what I'm trying to do as part of my PhD project. So it's tough questions, Albert.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that does actually bring me to the next question, because I mean, if we think about republicanism as a theory of the people controlling government, Pettit, after all, has argued that the Republican approach actually licenses and probably even mandates political authorities that are independent of the elected government of the day. So what do you see of the advantages and disadvantages of this Pettit idea of depoliticizing democracy?
Yeah, so well, first of all, I think it's really useful that democratic theorists have put forward this sort of argument, whereas in most cases, I think as political theorists, one tends to not really advocate that sort of solution. So I guess it's just really good that it's there as an argument to begin with. And the way I understood it is to, again, go back to the idea of controlled interference and of the two persons, one asking the other to take away the keys of the liquor cabinet. And the idea there is that if I ask you to interfere with me on certain terms that you will be able to respect, then maybe I will not be interfered with arbitrarily, and therefore I will not be unfree. Now, this shows already that Pettit's criterion for legitimacy does not necessarily need to be linked with popular control, with popular participation as such, but with popular control. And he's very precise about what he means by this idea of popular control. And this leaves open the room for independent agencies to actually do something that, from a instantaneous and day-to-day politics perspective, would not be very, very palatable, so to say. Now, I think that there are some issues with this idea because, first of all, it's not immediately clear who should decide and on how should it be decided whether a policy area becomes is given to some independent experts. And I think Pettit in his book is being quite vague about this. He surely couldn't rely on some sort of hypothetical consent of those who suffer this interference, because that would really bring him back to arguments that have been, I guess, kind of successfully challenged. He cannot also not rely on the goodness or badness of certain policies, because that decision of what is a good and a bad policy should really be the arena of a democratic setting. So likely, I think that while he has some good tools to endorse independent agencies as part of his theory, he would still have to then concede that these powers need to be given and controlled by the population at large. And this brings some very challenging questions, especially in the kind of agencies that we've seen these days, because it's very hard to say that people have actually controlled the terms of that interference. Nevertheless, I find it's a very useful way of thinking about these issues, and which is why I decided to kind of go along a little bit more with republicanism.
Yeah. That's very helpful indeed, and I think that really brings us to the heart of your current research and thinking on independent fiscal councils. Really, I mean, after all, you might say that taxation and war are the two things that states are supposed to do uniquely. And if we're talking about taxation, then I suppose the natural thought that people would have is that democratic states should tax democratically, that is to say, the elected government of the day should have the power to tax. But you're interested in these independent fiscal councils. So perhaps you could tell us what they are, or what do people think they might be, and what are the arguments for and against their establishment?
Yeah, so quite easy to put it very in brief terms. I think independent fiscal councils are agencies that have functional autonomy with respect to the budgetary authorities, and can decide and have prerogatives. They can decide basically on how much debt each year should the country or the government emit through deficit financing. So the idea here is that you take away one component of fiscal policies being the capacity again to tax and to spend, from the hands of politicians, because the idea is that they would somehow misuse it, and that instead elected experts would not have the same set of incentives to, in this case and in most cases, overspend. But let me kind of add here that this justification comes from the theory of deficit bias that economists have put forth. And it does not necessarily need to be in terms of overspending, but suboptimal spending. So if one looks at macroeconomic theories, it's generally accepted that the government should run countercyclical fiscal policies. And this deficit bias literature suggests that the government can either do too much or too little in certain cases. So I think the argument should be in terms of macroeconomic optimality. But let me also just say that this is a very new sort of kind of agency that is not really well defined as central banks. And indeed, I would like to kind of flesh out at least 3 types of these agencies that vary greatly in the kind of powers that they have. So probably at one extreme, we would have a trustee type of fiscal councils that can really set a maximum each year of what the chancellor should spend. So it sets a maximum compatible, ideally, with the objectives of smoothing the business cycle, but also not to run into financial troubles if the state overborrows. There's also another case of agency, which is more of an agent type, in which this independent agency is much closer to the government and works as a sort of statistical office, and in this case has no powers to actually control these instruments. The last case, the last format and kind of typology would be that of an orchestrator, and these distinctions are by no means so clear-cut. They should be more seen as a continuum. And this orchestrator are instead some rather parliamentary offices that provide more information on what the executive is doing. And these last form of independent agencies are the ones that I like to argue conform more to Republican principles. Yeah.
And they conform more to Republican principles because, in a way, they don't have the discretionary authority to make decisions, but they do have a role, so to speak, in informing public and parliamentary debate, and therefore, in a sense, enhancing the control of the people rather than taking control of the people away. Yeah, indeed. And over here again, I think sometimes Republicans can take 2 sides on this discussion, because one could, I think, plausibly argue that maybe even the trustee could defend some Republican principles if one sees the bad outcome of politicians' decisions to be dominating. Now, I feel like when it comes to fiscal policies, this step is a little bit too easy to make, because ultimately, whether we tax and spend, these decisions entail a good deal of disagreement among citizens. And so what I think we should safeguard more, given this reasonable disagreement, is rather the position that these ideas have in the democratic setting. And what I see as problematic as it is now is the informational asymmetry between the executives that decides and spends and borrows, and instead a parliament that can de facto only rubber stamp its approval and maybe question a couple of points. So what I have in mind is a form of a democratic independent agencies, which sounds quite strange, because what I want them to do is really to help us constrain the governments, to help us question its decisions and its choices in a democratic way, though. So that's very helpful, and it brings me to my final question, if I may. So which is really the contrast between independent fiscal councils on the one hand and central banks on the other. I mean, you rightly made the point about tax and spend, that this affects, people have different views about tax and spend, and also, of course, it affects the interests of people differently. But one can make exactly the same point about central banks. I mean, the interest rate will have different effects on different groups within society. So if you take this view about independent fiscal councils, that they have, if you like, an orchestrating role rather than a decision role, what are the arguments for central bank independence?
Yeah, now I have to say that part of me would just simply like to sort of bite the bullet and say that as it is now, central banking is not democratic enough, and that maybe they should have an advisory role to the government. Now, the fact is that I think there's some relevant difference in the sort of expertise that is needed in the two settings. Although in principle, from the perspective of the objective of the agency, fiscal councils and central banks are not too different from one another. So one tries to stabilize the business cycle and has a short-run interest in doing so, whereas there's a long-term goal of keeping the debt that doesn't explode. Much in the same way, central banks have an interest in monetary stability and at the same time some short-run stabilization, because they do not want the countries to go into recession. I think what's more problematic at the moment with central banks is the fact that this explanation that I've just given, that is quite simplistic and quite easy compared to what they actually do in practice. They have basically become the lender of last resort of both governments and the financial sector. Now, this, what I've just said, it kind of points actually to their increasingly powerful role that they play. So what I would advocate is a revision of their mandate. And I would keep open the option of giving them a much higher advisory role on these issues. However, I have not fully fleshed out, to be very honest with you, the whole consequences of what that would mean in institutional terms. Central banks are an incredibly complicated machinery of the state. So I prefer to be a bit cautious on those issues.
So I think cautious republicanism is always a good stance to have. I'd love to continue this conversation because, I mean, as you rightly say, I think these issues involve not just questions of political institutional design, but also relate very deeply, I think, to our understanding of key political concepts like freedom, popular control, and so on. So thank you very much for participating in this conversation. I've been very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.